Hi, Erin. Hi, everybody. Hi, Shar. I'll turn my video off, but I'm excited that I got in after reading those emails. So I'm anxious to hear your presentation. Good luck.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Hey, Liz. Hey, Erin.
Hi, Howard.
Hiya.
Hey, Howard.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you guys.
Hey, Howard.
It's been too long.
Indeed.
I'm not seeing anything on my screen but this massive logo thing.
You should be seeing a variety of logos that are
Okay.
from NCME, and so
Right. That's what I see.
giving kudos to those sponsors.
Okay, I got it. Then I got the right screen. Well, and there's the pitch for everybody to join. Right.
Started in just a moment. So hopefully everyone can see my screen, the presentation.
Now we just see your beautiful face, but not the presentation.
Oh no, okay, let's see.
Do you have multiple screens going?
Mhm.
You may need to share again.
Okay, we'll try one more time.
Hey, Lori.
All right, let's see. Any luck this time?
No, we don't see it yet.
So when I go to share, I'm sharing screen 3, which is my presentation. Let's see.
There we go.
Hey! Gotta love technology these days. Make sure this works as well. All right. Can everyone see the opening slide?
We see the full not in presentation mode, though.
It doesn't like me today. Let's see.
Go to slideshow.
I did that on the other one. It's still not. Okay, let me try something different. Apologies.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, I apologize. Thanks everyone for your patience. I will say good day because I'm not sure where folks are located and what time of the day it is. We're glad to have you here to learn a little bit more about our SCILLSS project. I'm going to provide a project well, a little bit of an overview, sort of an introduction, and then Erin Buchanan will go into some more details in regarding our project and an overview of everything we've been working on. We'll then turn that over to Daisy Redstein, who will talk a little bit about our skills principled assessment design approach. And then Charlene Turner will talk about developing classroom tasks, actually utilizing that principled assessment design approach. And finally, which is the part that's near and dear to all of our hearts, we'll hear today from Rhonda True. And Rhonda is from one of our states, and she'll talk to us about implementation of this work over the course of the past couple of years and how we've been able to do that working both at the local and the state level. So what does SCILLSS stand for? It's actually strengthening claims-based interpretations and uses of local and large-scale science assessment scores. This was one of 2 projects that was funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Enhanced Assessment Instruments Grants Program. It was actually announced in December of 16, and we finally were able to get contractually everything moving in April of 17, and we actually came to a close later this year in December of 2020. So we really were looking at a 4-year timeline. So with that, you can see we've moved pretty far into our work and into the project. And so while we'd love to share absolutely everything with you today, we're going to hit on a few things as I talked about earlier, really digging into our principled approach, looking more in depth at the application of that to our classroom science tasks, and then hearing from our state partner. This is a collaborative partnership. We have 3 states, 4 organizations, and 10 expert panel members. So I will say that Nebraska is our lead state. They're our grantee. And then both Montana and Wyoming are 2 of our partner states. So a little bit about our project goals. We have 3 overarching goals for SCILLSS. The first is, or was to, when we began, actually create a science assessment design model that establishes alignment with 3-dimensional standards by eliciting common construct definitions that drive curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Our second overarching goal was to strengthen a shared knowledge base among stakeholders for using principled design approaches to create and evaluate quality science assessments that generate meaningful and useful scores. That's one of the most important pieces that we like to really remind ourselves. We want to ensure that what is being produced is actually useful, whether it's to the student, the educator, parents, and others. So that was another piece that was near and dear to our hearts with this project. And then finally, we intended at the time when we started and through the course of this work to establish a means for state and local educators to connect their statewide assessment results with local assessments and instruction within a coherent standards-based system. An important note is that each of our 3 states has a strong commitment to local assessment. And so the goal has been to really capitalize on the relationship between local and statewide assessment systems to improve the way in which we can vision science assessment. As I mentioned before, we have quite a group of folks together working on this project. Again, the U.S. Department of Education is our funding entity. And Nebraska was the lead state and the grantee. They were the ones who stepped up very, very late in December when we were working on this and said, hey, we'll do this. We'll take a shot at it. The partner states, as I mentioned, were Montana and Wyoming. And in order for us to help the states to do this work, we know that state times are strapped. We know that they have lots of responsibilities on a daily basis. And so our EdCount team works to project manage in general. We work closely with each of our different vendor partners, as well as the experts, as well as the states, to make sure we're moving along throughout the course of the project and we were able to get everything done. So our partner vendors included ACS Ventures, SRI International, and then PIRE, that's the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation, and they were our external evaluator for this project. And then we have a beautiful and talented group of expert panelists who have been amazing throughout the course of this project. We've been able to reach out to them sort of individually across the year whenever we need specific feedback in a short or a timely manner. We'll reach out, have them provide a review and information recommendations back to us. At the same time, we also have an annual meeting, and we just had our last annual meeting in July where we brought everyone together virtually this time. We weren't face-to-face due to the pandemic, but it was great to be able to have that time together as we near the end of this project, to look back over all the work that we've done, but then to also think about how we could expand and move this work forward in the future. And our expert panelists have been critical to helping us sort of devise those types of things and moving forward and how we might continue this work. So I think this graphic conceptually helps us to understand how our project outcomes are connected and how they'll build toward our goal of helping states and districts use principled design to establish coherence within their standards-based system. This graphic displays a series of concentric circles. So the dark blue center circle is representative of student learning in relation to goals and expectations. Each additional circle shown in the lighter blues moving outward show the various types of assessments that are used within curriculum instruction and assessment system. Most proximal to student learning is formative assessment, which is embedded in the instructional flow and which educators can use to make immediate and ongoing adjustments to their teaching to improve student learning. Next, there's the interim and benchmark assessments, and then your actual student annual assessments or summative assessments. So while these may serve different purposes and uses, and are in some cases more distant from when learning actually takes place, the idea is that all of these assessments in the system are based on common construct definitions and are complementary in their measurement of what we expect students to know and be able to do within a content domain. So we expanded a bit more on this graphic, and you can see we've included our skills deliverables and hopefully help to explicate how they relate to the model of assessment that's tied to student learning. Each of the color-coded sections is representative of a different area or focus of our work. And these resources clearly align to and support our project goals, which are articulated there at the top of the graphic. And that first goal is coherence, allowing us to establish a means for states to strengthen the meaning of statewide assessment results and to connect those results back with local science, curriculum instruction, and assessment. And then our second skills goal is supporting the implementation of principled design and working to strengthen that knowledge base and experience among stakeholders and using these PAD approaches to create and evaluate quality science assessments that generate meaningful and useful scores. As we go throughout the presentation today, we'll talk about some of these different resources. And so I'm not going to go into those in depth, but just know this is sort of a highlight and a summary of how we vision this project working together. And as I mentioned, we have lots of resources and lots of things that we have developed over the course of 3.5 years of this project. If you go to www.skillspartners.org, that is our website. And if you click on the resources page, you'll see everything that has come out of this project is available for states, vendors, and others to utilize. Obviously, this is a grant funded by the U.S. Department of Education. So all of the deliverables that come out of the project are made publicly available. We have worked really, really hard at ensuring that we've been thoughtful and intentional about how we package these materials and provide them on our resources page so that others can go out, pick them up, and truly be able to implement without a ton of work on their end. So I'm now going to turn this over to Aaron. He's going to talk a little bit more about our self-evaluation protocols and our digital workbook. Aaron?
Thank you, Liz. Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's good to be with you today. I'm Erin Buchanan. I have been with the SCILLSS Project from the beginning, serving as the Deputy Project Director and really supporting Liz with the management of the project. And I today will be presenting some information about a compilation of assessment, literacy, and evaluation materials that SCILLSS Partners developed pretty early on in the project. This was our primary focus during year one. And it includes the development of a local and state self-evaluation protocol or protocols, and the development of a complementary digital workbook on educational assessment, design, and evaluation. So first, the focus is really going to be on providing that overview of our local and state self-evaluation protocols. As I mentioned, during year one of the project, we partnered with ACS Ventures to develop a set of protocols to really help educators take stock of their assessment system as a whole, as well as the individual assessments that comprise that system. And the foundational idea behind our work is that assessments should yield information that is meaningful and useful for a particular purpose or purposes. And the only way one can really know if an assessment yields valid and useful information is to evaluate evidence in relation to how its scores are to be interpreted and used. So this process of validity evaluation, which is very much steeped in the standards for educational and psychological testing, is what these protocols are designed to support. So very simply put, these protocols provide a means by which people can learn more about their assessment and their assessment systems as a whole. So when we talk about the types of assessments we are focused on in these evaluations, these could be existing assessments that state and local districts have in place already, or they may be assessments that they're considering on adopting. These could also be considered off-the-shelf tests developed by an outside vendor, or in the case of a local district, they may be district mandated assessments that are developed in-house. If you see kind of in this chart here at the local level, the protocols are really designed to focus more on those mandated assessments, and those might include interim or benchmark tests or end of course tests. And typically these types of assessments are used for lower stakes types of decisions, which might be to review and adapt curriculum or instruction, or to closely monitor student progress. And at the state level, the focus is on large-scale assessments that are required statewide, and they usually are associated with higher stakes for students, educators, schools, districts, or programs. So who are these protocols designed for? They are intended really for anyone involved with making decisions and using information from assessments. So we would anticipate that these would be state and district administrators. They might be instructional leaders, content specialists, assessment specialists, or any decision makers that are involved with state or local assessments. And we've provided 2 versions of the protocol, and they're both available on the skillspartners.org website. One is for local use specifically, and one is for state use. And the protocols are very similar, but they are slightly different in focus. But overall, our goal for both is the same. We want to be able to support educational leaders to strengthen their assessment literacy, to help them understand the nuances of validity and reliability, and to help them apply their knowledge in the evaluation of their own systems. A key goal here is, and what we set out to accomplish, is that we really wanted to provide a relatively easy way for educators to evaluate assessments and systems of assessment. And this work really begins with identifying the purposes and uses of test scores. So educators must first clarify and understand the purposes for which they're using assessment information and the questions they're trying to answer. And then they can determine the tests that they should use or could use to meet those needs and to address those questions. Other goals here are that educators will be able to collaborate with each other and have rich conversations to evaluate the appropriateness of any existing test interpretations, and that they'd be able to identify any potential gaps in their assessment programs, or identify any overlap in assessment information across multiple programs. The protocol is structured to lead educators through 4 steps. So you can see them here. The first step is to articulate your current and planned needs for assessment scores and data, to then identify all current and planned assessments. And then the next step is to gather and evaluate the evidence for each assessment in support of that validity argument. And then finally, to kind of take stock of all of that evidence and what it means to review both those individual assessments and the system of assessments. And I'm going to dive in now just in a little bit more detail about each of these particular steps in the process. But step 1 really, as I mentioned before, involves carefully identifying the intended purposes and uses for test scores resulting from individual assessments. So this might look different for different states using this protocol. For example, one state might focus on one assessment or a small number of assessments used within their accountability system. In another state, they may focus on multiple assessments used, and they may be used for a variety of purposes. But regardless of the specific scenario, assessments are tools for producing information to help answer questions. And as the protocol is completed, it's important to consider what questions one has about student achievement and what information the assessments can provide to help answer those questions. Another piece of this that's very important that we've really emphasized within the protocols is really understanding and thinking through the stakes associated with the intended uses of your test scores. So the higher the stakes, the greater the need for adequate evidence to support score meaning and use. So for example, you know, thinking about scenarios. Are students, are the results of an assessment being used to determine if students advance into a program or move on to the next unit? Sometimes stakes are high, and for those high stakes, once you set a student on a course and you can't undo it, that it could be potentially problematic if you aren't using the correct types of assessments to make those determinations. So this isn't really an exact rubric, but we're trying to promote this type of thinking around the purposes and uses of tests and test results. We want teachers to consider these stakes as they go through this evaluation process. Next slide. Thank you. The second step in using the protocol involves identification of the complete array of assessments you currently use or you plan to use to address specific needs. So you could choose with the protocol to organize your list of needs and assessments by content area, grade level, test purpose, or any other set of categories or dimensions that would help facilitate your review. So for example, you might choose to look at all of the assessments you use for science across grade levels, or you might choose to look at the set of assessments used at a particular grade level. So as you complete your identification of assessments, there may be areas where there's some overlap. So there could be 2 or more tests that yield scores used for a common purpose, as well as areas with gaps where you do not have an assessment that could provide relevant information. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of the worksheet that is included in the protocols, and it's pretty simple. In the left-hand column there, you'll see that it allows educators to capture the need or purpose of the assessments within their system. And then on the right there, to identify any and all assessments they have in place or plan to have in place to meet that need or purpose. Next slide. So step 3 and 4 of the protocol involves then actually gathering and evaluating validity evidence. So this comes after you've identified each need or purpose, the intended uses of those assessments, the stakes associated with the assessments, and so it's then time to compile and review the evidence you have. And in the protocols, we've structured the evaluation around 4 fundamental validity questions that are necessary to guide the collection of evidence to support or refute the validity of interpretations and uses of test scores. And each of these key validity questions that you see here are supported by the standards for educational psychological testing. And they relate to, as you can see, construct coherence, comparability, fairness and accessibility, and consequences. So just give you a moment to kind of take a look through those questions. All right, next slide. This is a screenshot of a summary page of the protocol. So it's pretty basic, and what it allows you to outline the assessment and focus. You can see in the upper left-hand corner who takes the assessment. In the upper right corner of the worksheet, it allows you to capture for each of the key validity areas that we looked at the total score from your evaluation. So these scores will provide, at the end of this process, a way to quantify the strength of the evidence that you've gathered. And we rank that kind of on a scale of low to moderate and strong. And then toward the bottom of the screen, again, it provides a way to document whether the stakes of the assessment are considered low or high for students and educators. Next slide. And so moving on to the next page of this worksheet, this is intended to capture the necessary details for determining the adequacy of the evidence for each assessment in the assessment system. So the worksheet can be completed with and support critical conversations with a team of people from a state or district. So to complete this worksheet, we would ask a team of educators to consider each of the validity questions listed in that left-hand column, and then to gather and summarize the evidence related to each question kind of in that middle column. And at that point, to carefully consider whether the evidence is adequate in support of that particular question. The adequacy of the evidence is really determined by your judgment in consideration of your state and local educational context and the assessment system. So this slide here just shows for each of the key validity areas, the worksheet offers spaces for you to record your ratings and to capture, again, the total scores from that evaluation. Next slide. Once you've completed steps 1 through 3 of the self-evaluation protocol, it's then time to review and evaluate how well your assessment system supports your primary purposes and uses. And for this component of the work, it's important to review each assessment purpose and use and identify areas with adequate evidence for the test score use and others where the degree of data and evidence may not be substantial. And this final snapshot shows then how we would kind of summarize the results of the evaluation of each individual assessment. So you'd consider you'd be able to consider here all of the characteristics of your assessment system, and you could view the evidence from a holistic perspective. You'd be able to, work with your review team to consider kind of across the board whether the assessments you have in place or plan on using adequately meet your system goals and objectives, and then determine your subsequent actions to take regarding each assessment in your state. And now I'm going to transition kind of to the second portion of our work. We developed a companion resource to the self-evaluation protocol, and that is the digital workbook on educational assessment design and evaluation. So we developed the digital workbook to include a collection of 5 virtual chapters. And the purpose of the workbook is to help educators understand how to determine the quality and usefulness of the information each of their assessments provides. So these chapters were intentionally designed to address the same concepts raised in the protocols. So they address and dive more deeply into each of those 4 validity questions that we shared. So they fit together and they provide some additional background information and resources for educators to grow their knowledge about those foundational assessment topics. The first chapter, or the introductory chapter, provides a high-level introduction to the 4 validity topics and the concept of validity and reliability. And then we have 1 chapter each on those 4 validity questions of construct coherence, comparability, fairness and accessibility, and consequences. And each chapter is about an hour in length, and just to kind of give you an idea of the format, we developed a scripted voiceover to accompany a PowerPoint presentation. So in terms of the audience, really we're talking about the same audience that we have in mind for the self-evaluation protocols. since this really is this digital workbook considered a companion to the protocols to help support their implementation. Next slide. The 4 main chapters in the digital workbook connect the validity questions to specific forms of evidence that can be gathered throughout the assessment lifecycle. So the evidence necessary to make judgments about assessment validity comes from every part of what we can think of as the assessment lifecycle. And this cycle encompasses design and development of the test, administration, scoring, analysis, reporting, and the use of scores. And we all understand that, you know, assessment, design, and development implementation is an iterative and ongoing cycle for as long as the scores from the test are used. But the 4 validity questions really represent broad areas, and each subsumes many other questions which we've embedded within the digital workbook. But all of these validity areas require evidence from across that assessment life cycle. So for example, if you just consider construct coherence and how that's addressed within assessment development, the idea is that you would be gathering evidence from test design and development of a test. You'd be gathering evidence from the scoring and the analysis of the test. So part of what these chapters do is help educators understand how you might gather that validity evidence from throughout the course of the test cycle. This slide just shows kind of what I've already explained. We have 5 chapters within this digital workbook series, starting with that introductory chapter, and then each of the subsequent chapters focus on those 4 key validity questions. And these next 2 slides are really just a table of contents that show what we've included within the digital workbook. I will say that it's this is really the tip of the iceberg. I think we've put a lot of great information into these chapters and into this workbook, but an hour is definitely not enough to cover all of the content that needs to be addressed with regard to each of these areas. Another thing to point out is that we intentionally designed these chapters so that an educator doesn't have to necessarily go through these in order. They can kind of pick and choose and jump around and use those specific modules to meet their needs at that point in time. And one more thing here, you can kind of see as you look through the structure of each of these chapters that they're very similar. We typically start off by reviewing key concepts from previous chapters. We spend quite a bit of time defining and describing the validity concept and focus, and then we dive pretty deeply into offering some additional validity questions and sharing kind of how those relate to that assessment life cycle we're talking through. But all of these materials are posted to the SCILLSS Project website, as I mentioned. So hopefully you all feel free to take a look at those and reach out to us if you have any questions. I think that brings me to the end here of my section. So I'll hand it off to Daisy.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about another part of our work where we focused on the design and development of large-scale assessments for science. And so just to give you some background to start off about what we think about when we think about assessment is really that assessment is a process of reasoning from evidence. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to gather evidence about the students in order to make some claims about what they know or can do. So when the assessment really needs to start with a model of cognition. And so this is, how do students represent their knowledge, and what are the ways that the different concepts might be connected to each other? How are they going to talk about these different concepts? What are the things that they should really know? And then we also need to think about, what can we see or what can we observe about our students in order to allow us to make inferences on this, on what we want the students to know. So we try to, when you're doing an assessment, there's some sort of type of observation of your students. And then from that observation, you're interpreting that in order to make this inference about what can a student know and can do. So there's really a cohesiveness to this. All of these things are related to each other, because how you think about what students know is tied to what you're going to observe and how you interpret those observations. So there's a coherence there. And then if we go to the next slide, and you can just scroll through there. So when we're creating our assessments, what we really want to think about is making sure that we know what we're trying to assess. So our constructs are well defined. We know how the system works, the system being the set of assessments along with the curriculum and instruction. And if that's all well defined and we really know what that looks like, then we can be sure that the scores that we're getting from our assessments really do reflect on what students know and can do, or what they've learned, or what it is we want to know about the students. And then once we're confident that the way that we're using the scores is really accurate and reflects what we want to know, then we know that we can use those to do things like to think about how you might modify your instruction or build on your instruction, to track student progress, to make decisions about the curriculum. Next slide. So when you're thinking about a standards-based assessment and accountability model, what you really want to start with is those content standards or the performance standards. And based on those standards of really understanding what that means in terms of students, how students think about them, how students interact with them, you want to build both the curriculum and instruction and the assessment. So it's important that these things are tied to the same overall model of what you're going to be looking at. And then from there, when you do your assessment, you can be sure that, okay, we're measuring what we believe was the same things that they were in the curriculum and instruction. And so we can really use this assessment. We know that this assessment reflects back on that as well. And so we can use that for, oops, too far. That's all right. For that evaluation and accountability. Okay, now you can go. And so, but if you don't have that alignment between the standards, between the curriculum, between the assessment, then you're not always sure that that assessment reflects on the curriculum instruction. And so you can't be confident about your results, and you shouldn't be using those for evaluation purposes. So as Liz also mentioned earlier, one of the things that we really focus on when we're creating the assessment is that coherence picture. Is there coherence between what it is we believe students are learning, what we want to know about the students, and how our assessment is reflecting on that? And so making sure that that coherence is there across the whole assessment system is really important in supporting the validity of your assessment. Okay, next slide. So how do we create that coherence? So we use a principal design process. And so this is basically just a process that really helps focus a developer on the purpose of the assessment and what are the critical decisions they need to make when they're creating their assessment. So it kind of guides them to think about this coherence as they're going through the whole entire process. And so it highlights those decisions that they need to make sure that people are actually thinking critically about the important decisions and making those in order to sort of support the validity at the end. The other thing nice about the principal design process is that it's replicable and scalable. So that means that once you go through this process once, it's easier to kind of go through again or with similar topics, because you can build on the information that you've already gathered and the decisions you've already made and the conversations that you've had while making those decisions. So we went through this process for the large scale, and as well as the the classroom assessments. I'm going to talk about the large scale right now. And we have a sample set of resources that are available on the website. So I'm going to go more into the process, but just know that you can always visit the website to get more information. And I believe we have a white paper too that talks more about this as well. So the principal design process that we use is called evidence-centered design. And this is based on Messick's validity questions, but really where you want to focus on what is it I want to know about my students? So what's the knowledge, skills, or attribute that I want to assess? And that's what we refer to as our student model. So that's thinking about maybe it's one construct, maybe it's multiple constructs. How are they related to each other? What is it I really want to know about my student? And then thinking about what's the evidence I want to collect. So what is it that I'm going to be observing? What behaviors, what performances, what is it that students are going to do that's going to allow me to say something about their student model? And that's related to the evidence model. And then finally, okay, I know what evidence I want to collect. How do I get there? How do I get students to actually give me that evidence? So what does a task have to look like? Or what does a situation have to be like that will allow students to produce that evidence? So you can see in the picture here on the task model, we have the task is in yellow, and then a critical component of that is what the student actually produces. So what is it I'm actually going to look at of the students, and that's in green. And then when we go to our evidence, it's not only how do I score that, so what are the ways, what are the things I can observe about their, what they've produced, but then also that reflection piece of how does what my observations tie back to what I want to know. And so again, as we're going through this assessment and developing it, we're thinking about these different components and their relationships and tying it all back together to ensure that the task that I give is going to give me the information I need in order to be able to say what I want to say about the student. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so there's when we go through this process, for the large scale, we have a 5-phase principal design process. So at the top is the domain analysis. If we could, okay. And so here, what we're focused on in domain analysis is really understanding what does the domain look like? What are the types of things that I want to think about when I'm measuring my student? And I like to think about this as we're not really focused completely on the assessment at this point. What we're really focused on is just understanding the domain, understanding what it looks like. And this is a really good place that you can build your curriculum from, and you can build your assessment from, and it ties everything together. And then in the next phase, in the domain modeling, that's when we really start focusing on that, what we call the assessment argument of what do I want to measure? What do I need to observe about my students in order to be able to say something? And what are the tasks going to look like? And here you're really thinking about the range of possibilities there and you're not necessarily tying yourself to just one assessment or one way or thinking about constraints at this point. You're thinking about the different ways in which this could be assessed and the different types of evidence and information that can be provided from students. And then in the phase 3 is the conceptual assessment framework. And here's what I think of it, this is when reality sits in. This is when you start bringing in those constraints and saying, okay, for my purpose, well, I know I have 45 minutes, I know I can do it in this type of format. How do I want to structure these tasks? So you're not actually building the tasks at this point, but you're getting closer and you're narrowing down to really thinking about what the structure is that you're going to be building. And then in the next phase, that's when you actually create the tasks. So that's when you start building your tasks, building your rubrics, putting it all together, making sure that your assessment has all of the pieces that it needs to have. And then in the final phase is when you actually deliver your assessment, and then you want to think about how do you evaluate the feedback that comes back from the students, not only reflecting on what is it I want to say about the students, but also are there modifications and changes I want to make? How do I make sure that that my assessment has that validity, that it's measuring what I want to measure? So that's sort of the principle as a whole. And you can go to the next slide, that's fine. So one thing to point out is that there's a lot of work that gets done before you actually create your assessment. So there's a lot of design work that goes into it. In the domain analysis, really thinking about those representations. With the science standards, really thinking about the different dimensions of the science standards. You have your cross-cutting concepts, your practices, your content. How do these all fit together? There's a lot that goes into some of these standards. So how do I want to think about this, and what does it want to mean for my assessment? And then in your domain modeling, really thinking about that assessment argument and articulating that. And again, in your assessment framework, revisiting it. And we talk about these as different layers, as if, oh, you do this, then you do this, then you do this, but it's a very iterative process. You're always going back and you're reflecting on what you already thought about, you're making updates, you're rethinking it. And what's important is sort of at the end, though, is you have this cohesiveness of, okay, I can see how what I did in the domain analysis moves down into the domain modeling, how that affects the assessment framework. And so as you're moving through these, you're getting more specific, but you're also making sure that you're tying things back and that things are working together. And this really allows you the setup of, you have all these design documents, you have the design that then you can take and create your assessments from. Okay, next slide. So in the work that we've done, we went through all of these different phases, and we have different documents. So I'll just give a brief overview, and then I'm going to go into each of these in a little more specificity. So for our domain analysis, we started with that overall claim. What do I want to say about the students? And then we broke that up into smaller measurement targets. And then from there, we unpacked or elaborated on the dimensions. And then we created our integrated dimension map to bring things together. And so this was all about really focusing on what's the picture of what I want to say about the students, and what does this look like? What are the different things I want to think about? In domain modeling, we have a template that we use called a design pattern that really starts laying out those, the assessment argument and the different dimensions there. And then when we get to the task conceptualization, or the, we have the task templates. We also have task specifications and item specifications. So we have different documents there that again move down in the level of specificity of creating your actual tasks, but they provide that guidance on what you actually want to create. And then we have our assessment development. And so we actually have some tasks that we've created for this, and with some scoring rubrics and scoring notes there. So next slide. So again, in the domain analysis, the main goal here is really to get an understanding of what this looks like. And so for the NGSS, there's a lot of trying to understand what these performance expectations mean. How are students engaging with this? What does it mean when we're combining these the practice with the content and the cross-cutting concepts? What does it mean for those to be integrated? How do we want to set the boundaries of this assessment? So next slide. Okay, so we started with the claim. And so for a large scale assessment, this is really, what is that overall, what's the goal of this assessment? What do we want to know about the student? What's our expectation of the student? And then also providing some idea of what's the evidence going to look like. So making sure that your overall claim is measurable. You don't have to get into the specifics of the evidence, but thinking about when you're creating your claim of what this is going to tell us of, is there evidence that can be provided that's going to show this? So that's the idea of warranting the claim of, when you make a statement, what is it that you're going to say that's going to back up that claim? And having that overarching claim written in a way that provides you some guidance on what that type of evidence can be, is going to be helpful when you move forward. So next slide. So your claim is at a very high level, though. It kind of covers the entire scope of your assessment. And so that's really hard to create an assessment just from an overall claim. So we need ways to break that up and to start thinking about, how do we get closer to what actual tasks do I need? And so we started by creating measurement targets. And so these are descriptions that are related to your claim, but they break it up in ways that kind of separate different pieces of the claim. So you can say, okay, when I'm measuring the claim, I want to make sure I'm covering this part, and this part. And the other thing about your overall claim is it might be that you have sort of one claim that covers multiple grade levels. Your measurement targets can be more specific to a particular grade level, because what you're going to be measuring in 5th grade is probably going to look different from what you're measuring in 8th grade. So making sure that you're sort of starting to build down into what's my expectations for the 5th grader versus the 8th grader is here. And we found that since we weren't working with a particular curriculum, we wanted this to be sort of state independent or curricular independent. One of our starting places for this was actually in the next generation science standards. They have bundles for how might you group the different concepts that are in the NGSS. And so we found that as a really nice way to start organizing our measurement targets and looking at those bundles and saying, okay, within these different bundles, what does that mean for 5th grade, for the different grade levels? So that was kind of just, again, the measurement targets are getting more specific, a way to break up that claim into something that you can then start building from. So then from there, the bundles that we created in the measurement targets had specific PEs that were aligned to them. And so our next step was understanding, okay, what does it mean for a student engaging with this measurement target? And so looking at the PEs, looking at what's included, breaking it up for NGSS, what we did is we said, okay, so what are the practices that we want that are included here? And then what does that look like for students? So trying to define what are those focal knowledge, skills, and abilities? What are the ways that students engage with this for the practices, and thinking about it for the cross-cutting concepts, and thinking about it separately for the content. So one of the reasons that we really wanted to break it up and sort of think about each of these components separately is when we create this integrated assessment, we do want to make sure that we're pulling from all of these different components. So having a better understanding of what it is that, how these different components look like, what do they mean for students to interact, can help us see if those components are then also incorporated into our assessment tasks. Okay, next slide. But then at the same time, we don't want to leave them as completely separate. Because one of the goals of the next generation science standards is really to provide this integrated understanding, we do want to bring it back and we want to make sure students are integrating it. So the next step for us was to think about, well, how do you integrate all of, okay, I've broken this apart, I know what all of this means, how do I bring that back together? And so dimension map is really a visual picture that sort of says, okay, well, here's the content knowledge, here's how the practices come in, here's how the cross-cutting concepts come in, and putting it all together in sort of a nice visual that really allows you to see, oh, when I'm talking about this content, it really is bringing in these practices. And so this is what I really want to focus on when I'm thinking about this component. It also allows you to see what the separation is. So you might not be able to create one task that covers everything because there's still a lot in there. But having this map allows you to say, oh, look, a task really could cover this group and another task could cover this group, and together they kind of cover the whole thing. So it just gives you that representation of what the domain really looks like. How do I want to think about it? How do I think about this integration? Next slide. So now we know what the domain is. We're completely clear. No issues there. So let's think about our assessment. And so that's when we move to our design pattern and our task templates and task and item specifications. And we're focusing on, okay, now that I have this whole picture of the domain, what parts of it am I going to cover? What am I not going to cover? What evidence am I going to look for? What do tasks look like? Okay, next slide. So the design pattern is based off of work that Mislevy and Haertel have done and others have done. And it really focuses on identifying what are those focal knowledge, skills, and abilities or attributes, the FKSAs that I want to cover. What's that evidence? What's the observation I'm going to make? And here you're listing out sort of the potential observations that you can have. So what are the different ways that students might show me that they have these FKSAs? And then what do the tasks look like? And so this is where you really first start thinking about what those tasks might look like, again, at a very high level, just in general, what are some of the things they have to have? What are ways that they could vary? And starting to plan for your tasks. Next slide. So in the task template, so this is a tool, again, another tool that is really focused on, okay, now I want to actually create a specific task. And I think we can just, I think there's two more that we can, yeah. And so you take what you have in your design pattern and you create, it becomes more specific at this point. You're bringing in some of the constraints of the format, you're bringing in some of the, what might be grade level appropriate for these students, what are the different ways they might represent their knowledge, what are the considerations I need to think about when I'm thinking about my prompt and my situation. So it's not specific enough to get to one task, but it starts narrowing down the possibilities of tasks and laying out what this is. Now, for different projects, we have these different templates, and I'm going to talk about the next two templates, but different projects might only need a task template, or there might be different ways to go through this. So the level of specificity on this task template is really up to the needs, and how many levels do you need to go through might differ for different purposes. But for our purposes, we wanted to start with the task. That's fine, you can go to the next slide. We wanted to start with the task template, but then move to, okay, now let's get even more specific, because we want to start thinking about other things of like, what kind of phenomena might we be able to create this from? And again, it's about narrowing down the possibilities so that you can give this to task developers and they can create tasks. You don't want it so specific that it's only one task, but you do want to start narrowing things down. And so this again builds on from the design patterns to the task templates. What are the things I'm pulling out? I'm making decisions based on what the evidence, the information I have in those, and making some decisions that then narrows these things down. So it really focuses on what kind of information am I going to get from the students? What are the ways, what are things that I need to have in this task? And what are some ways that these tasks can still vary? And what are the ways that students are going to respond? And that'll help kind of set up what you need to ask for in the task. So then we have our item specification. So within the task specification, one of the things that we'll state is how many items. So we think of a task as an overarching scenario with multiple items, and then that are all related to that same scenario. And so then we're here again, we're at the item level, and we'll say, okay, so we had already stated that this has let's say three items. Now, what do we need to know about these individual items? How many of what are they covering? So which FKSAs are they covering? Which might also be related to which components, which dimensions are they covering? Do we need them all the prompts to cover all the dimensions? Or maybe we want to focus on just the practice and the content for one, and then bring in the cross-cutting concept on another. So it's, again, getting more specific, thinking about what's going to be offered to the students, what's the focus of these specific items, and how are students going to respond to them. Okay, next slide. And then finally, we get to our, okay, you've got these fabulous item specifications and task specifications. Now you can go and create your tasks and your rubrics. And we just want to stress that it's really important to create the rubrics while you're creating the tasks around the same time, because when you're creating your rubrics, you're going to be thinking also, what is the actual evidence that students are going to be providing? And is this the evidence that I actually want them to be providing? And so it gives you that moment to reflect on what you're actually asking of students and making sure that that's aligned to what it is you're trying to say about the students. Okay, next slide. So for our summative assessment tests that we've developed, we started off with saying, okay, well, a task on this is probably going to have one phenomena or stimulus. There's going to be 3 or more items that are linked to that. We want to make sure that there are different ways that students can interact with this. So make sure that it's not just all a big, huge block of text, but that might be part of it depending on the performance expectation or the FKSA, but also making sure that we have some visual representations in there. And some of the things that might vary is the number of items. Well, we said 3 or more. This could vary depending on which bundle, which PE you're addressing, how many dimensions are addressed by each item, and is also something that can vary. But then finally, making sure that our tasks do allow students the opportunity to provide a range of proficiency. And so thinking about how we're going to be scoring this and what the complexity of what we're asking them to do and how that relates to the PEs. And again, we have these on our website if you'd like to take a look at them at some point. Next slide. So the overall hierarchy of, we talked about all the different documents that we have, but so you can see that we started off with an overall claim. So this is for grade 5. In a claim, from there we created 4 bundles. And again, those bundles were related to those NGSS bundles. Each bundle is associated with multiple PEs. And then within the PEs, we have the measurement targets that we defined. And then from there, we created multiple FKSAs. And then the task sets for our purposes were tied to specific FKSAs. So each task, as you can see, is just sort of one subset of a measurement target of a bundle, which is one subset of a claim. Next slide. So then for our task map, what you can see is that we have for each task laid out, okay, what's the FKSA it's measuring, what's the performance expectation it's related to, what's the phenomena or scenario, and what's each of the items. And then you would fill out for each of the items, is this including the practice? Is it including the content? Is it including the cross-cutting concept? What's being covered on this? So that provides for each of your tasks that you create, there's sort of a quick snapshot of what's being covered on the task. And then next slide. And so all of this really allows you to see the flow of how we went from the bundle or the claims down to the specific tasks. It allows you to kind of follow that reasoning that we did. What are the decisions that we made when we were creating these tasks, and what are the decisions that other people could make? So you can really see that alignment and that coherence throughout the flow of the documents and the flow of the tasks. It also allows, there's possibilities for, it shows sort of those decision points, and it says, hey, there's other ways that these tasks could be created. So for your purpose, you might want to think about these different tasks and think about these features and how can you vary it. So it really helps support future work in this area as well. So now I will pass this along to Shar to talk about what we did at the classroom level.
All right, thanks, Daisy. I took the baton happily. My name's Charlene Turner. Greetings and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I'm going to be sharing information with you about developing classroom science assessment tasks using a principle design approach. And I wanted to say that as we started in this presentation, a project goal of SCILLSS is to strengthen a shared knowledge base about instruction and assessments, and use of that knowledge base by stakeholders, which includes a large group of people, but primarily educators and administrators, for using a principle design approach to create and evaluate science assessments that really do generate meaningful, interpretable, and useful scores about student science learning. So student learning and assessment of that learning is really central or the core of the work within the project. So in this portion, we'll be sharing information about developing classroom science assessment tasks using a principle design approach and highlighting the corollaries between our summative assessment work and our classroom-based assessment work. So again, I'll be highlighting a way in which that principle design approach has been utilized and translated based on our summative assessment work that Daisy has just laid out for us well, and those design tools to classroom formative assessment and design tools that have been developed for use by educators to create these assessments to measure students' three-dimensional science learning. And I just wanted to add that we have fully implemented, if you will, through multiple workshops and opportunities to work with educators at the local level to try on these tools and to ultimately find success with them being able to use these tools to generate these assessments of science learning. Next slide, please. All right, so the multiple phases defining a principal design approach to assessment development are represented both in our large scale and our classroom assessments. And we do understand that applying a principal design approach to assessment work, it is really perceived, I think, across vendors and states and other groups, educators, as perceived as being a very complex, and it is a multi-layered process, but that is perceived possibly as being very dense, hard to do, let alone being very time intensive. So in our work to maintain the integrity of this approach, we've necessarily then had to translate the design process from our large-scale assessment work to district level and classroom use, while we maintain the critical purpose and use of the key elements of each phase. So this approach and the design tools need to be accessible, they need to be interpretable, and they need to be usable by educators. Otherwise, you know, their purpose is not achieved. So to this end, we've taken what's shown here under the tools and the elements for state summative and represented for you what those similar classroom elements or tools are. And we have created two tools, the unpacking tool and the task specification tool, to address domain analysis, domain modeling, and task conceptualization. So again, thinking about, in order for this information to be used meaningfully by educators, we don't expect them to go through the process that we would, that is a little more entailed and takes each one of these phases and breaks it down into multiple elements and multiple design tools. So how do we get the essence of each of those tools into a more compact, usable format for educators? So we've gone from a larger set to a more discrete set, if you will, of tools, including an unpacking tool, the task specification tool, and then ultimately getting into those later phases around assessment development, providing training and tools on the actual development of tasks. And as Daisy said, while thinking about generating scoring rubrics, the tools to develop those scoring rubrics, scoring notes to support test administration, and then also we do provide exemplars of high quality responses. Okay, so on this next set of slides, we just want to highlight the goals of each of the phases and discuss kind of the connections and the translation between our summative and our classroom assessment work. So it's important to note that whatever phase we're in, we share common goals between the summative and the classroom-based assessment. So as Daisy has highlighted, in this first tool in which educators are unpacking the dimensions for a particular standard, a state standard as it relates to the next generation science standards, we want to understand the components. What are the dimensions, the science and engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts that are represented in that particular NGSS standard or state science standard. It's very important to know that because we want to understand well what we're measuring, what constructs we're measuring, and we want to begin to gain an understanding about the way students will engage with that content and ultimately show evidence of their student learning. And we want to ensure that we're defining what some of those boundaries are of student performance. So it's only appropriate to measure content at that expected grade level as defined by those constructs in the unpacking tool in the showing you where the dimensions are unpacked. And we can bring along as kind of additional information to support and scaffold the task what we know students have learned prior to that grade that's being assessed. But we don't want to be out of bounds with regard to what those grade level or grade band expectations are. We would not want the task to reflect higher expectations or those that students may not have had an opportunity to learn. So that unpacking tool then provides a clear focus for what is to be measured, and it helps teachers to plan for assessment. The unpacking tool requires teachers to really think critically about those three dimensions of the PEs that we've been talking about and really understand what they really mean. And it is a bit time intensive, but the benefit is that once educators have really unpacked that dimension, kind of pulled it or as Daisy was talking about with the summative assessment tools, they're able then to put it back together in meaningful ways to assess student learning. And we would emphasize when we're working with educators on the development of this tool that it is a living document, if you will, and that the process is iterative. So as Daisy said, even though we have these defined phases that look like there's kind of a sequence in which they're done, it's a very iterative process. And by defining well and working in one phase, it informs the next and so on. And we look at how we have to circle back and integrate what's being learned and achieved during each one of these phases in order to ultimately create tasks that are meaningful and useful and yield information about student learning. One of the other things I wanted to mention about when educators go through the development of this particular tool, what we hear them saying to us in these workshops is how much this is informing how they understand the content, of course, and also how it will inform their instruction and use and selection of curriculum materials and resources. So it really has multiple benefits that extend well beyond ultimately developing those assessment tasks. So on the next slide, we've just given you an example of what the template looks like. It's populated with a particular PE and then those foundation boxes or each of the dimensions that are associated with the PE are populated here along with key aspects and prior knowledge associated with each one of those dimensions. So let's talk a little more specifically about the components then of that unpacking tool. So as we've been emphasizing, it's critical that we understand what is being measured, what we want to know across each of those dimensions associated with a particular PE. So we ask educators to use a set of tools that are steeped in NGSS to identify the key aspects or the underlying concepts that support each PE. So they take that dimension statement associated with a science and engineering practice, a DCI, a disciplinary core idea, or a cross-cutting concept, and they delve into it and they pull it apart and they look at all the aspects of it that could be represented in a assessment task. It's also important to then know what prior knowledge students should have had an opportunity to learn prior to being taught these PEs. So we know that when we look at state standards in science or the NGSS, we see an increase in the complexity and sophistication of these standards over the K-12 grades. And we have higher expectations for student understanding of that content. So when we're building a task, by knowing what students have learned previously, we can support and scaffold their interaction with the task by including some of that information, because it is not the stuff of measurement that we're looking at here, the constructs that might be directly aligned to the key aspects in the dimension, but there are things that we could provide to the student, for example, in terms of background knowledge, these additional skills that might elicit their background knowledge, their thinking, and situate them to the task. So what are the key aspects of that grade level expectation? What do we expect students to come with? And we can draw on that to develop the task. And importantly, talking about the relationships between the cross-cutting concepts and the SEP, the science and engineering practice. So in the tool, there's a place for educators to do that and look at those connections, because as Daisy's been pointing out, that's what the NGSS is about, right? We want students to use reasoning and sense-making through integration of these dimensions to show us what they know and can do relative to a specific PE. So we just have a couple slides then that further explicate this. So again, with the PE being indicated, we go to resources that define for us then those foundations or dimensions that are associated with a particular PE. And here, all of our examples are related to 5-PS1-1, develop a model to describe that matter is made of particles too small to be seen. So the educator can identify what those foundations are. And then on the next slide, we show how we ask educators then to unpack it. So again, they will, for each of those dimensions, as they relate back to a specified performance expectation or science standard, identify those key aspects and what are pieces of prior knowledge that we would expect students to come with to support their ability to understand these key aspects at the next grade level or grade band. And similarly, on the next slide, we show how we've then, again, a model of how educators might unpack the science and engineering practice, which is developing and using models in this instance. So there are multiple aspects of that practice that are could be assessed. So identifying the components of a model, or using a model to reason, or reason about the relationship of the different components of a model, or selecting and identifying relevant aspects of a situation or phenomena. So a single question within a task may not necessarily address all of these key aspects, but there might be ways to combine them in a task or to assess them individually. So again, unpacking the key aspects that will be the drivers for the task that educators will design. And here, an example of the cross-cutting concepts. I wanted to point out here, though, that one of the things that we're really asking educators to consider is that relationship of the cross-cutting concept, in this instance, scale, proportion, quantity, back to the science and engineering practice relating to modeling, right? So certainly scale and proportion are things to consider based on the content, the DCI, particles too small to be seen, properties of matter, and their relationship to how models represent what students know and understand about that content knowledge. And in addition to working with them in small groups and presenting a lot of content and providing these resources and tools available to them, we also then tie it back to what are the resources that you can utilize to support this work. So of course, we look at the framework, we reference the state science content standards, and as mentioned earlier, in the early days of SCILLSS, we did evaluation of alignment between the state standards and the NGSS, and looking at those intersections and their how well they complemented each other, and they did. We also provide them with the NGSS, and then those appendices that provide information about progression in student learning over time. So again, when we're thinking about prior knowledge and what might exceed what should be measured at a particular grade level, being aware of those assessment boundaries, those appendices are very helpful. And then also with respect to the evidence statements, they really define observable features of the student performance by the end of the grade. So for this particular PE that we've been talking about, modeling particles too small to be seen, it talks about the observable features focusing on components of a model, or relationships between components of the model and the DCIs, and using information to describe how matter is composed of tiny particles too small to be seen. So those evidence statements provide additional information for the educator to consider about ways they might develop a assessment task for a particular NGSS. So we revisit these tools frequently during our work and our work with educators. So in phase 2, domain modeling, and phase 3, conceptual assessment framework, again, you'll see here that the goals between our state and our classroom-based assessment resources are similar. We're beginning to kind of lay out that argument, and just like in the state summative assessment tools and resources, you know, we're starting to hone in and getting educators closer to having the information they need in order to go forth and develop these high-quality assessment tasks. So what's going to be covered? What's not covered? How will students demonstrate their knowledge? What is the evidence that needs to be produced once we have a good understanding of what we're measuring as defined by that unpacking tool? How are students going to demonstrate their knowledge? And begin to think about what are those tasks going to look like. So the three resources or four that are indicated for the summative assessment, from design patterns down to the item specifications, are kind of wrapped up and integrated into a single tool, and we call that the task specification tool. So this tool then really allows educators to translate that PE-specific unpacking, all the work they've done on that unpacking tool of the 3 dimensions, into assessment task. So pull it apart, now we're starting to integrate it and bring it back together so we can make sense of that work to result in the creation of these tasks. And it's a tool that really allows educators then to start making decisions about, given that I want to measure these things, these knowledge, skills, and abilities as they relate to that standard that we're assessing, what counts as evidence? How will I know that a student has mastery of this content? What will it look like? How am I going to get that evidence? And it also starts, it enables educators to really think about, given their instruction, because these are classroom-based tools, right? And they're meant to be informative in terms of teachers making inferences about student learning so they can inform instruction, make adjustments to it, identify misconceptions of student learning. So they know how they've taught it, right? So they can be thinking about how am I going to provide opportunities in these tasks for students to transfer and apply learning that has occurred during instruction to new challenges, to related phenomena, the way scientists and engineers would, right, in the field. We want to create assessment situations that allow students to show us that transfer of their learning. And it identifies the key elements needed to be addressed by task developers. So we'll show you some examples of this, but really what we're creating then, based on the unpacking tool, is a palette of specific elements that can be represented in a task. And they are purposeful and useful for the specific skills that are being measured. We want the task to be meaningful and interpretable, right? So at a point along an instructional pathway, an educator decides that they need to have information about student learning at this point in time. So how do I go about developing tasks? I use these tools. I can collect from this palette, an array of elements that are represented here. I can design specific tools to assess student learning at a particular point during an instructional sequence. And of course, we've provided a template for teachers to use. So we just want to give you some snapshots of that template. Typically, what we always try to do is provide a description of what it is, the what. We give some examples and within the tool, but we also then provide exemplars that have been generated by the project as resources for educators when they're developing their own tools. So that first element, it's pretty straightforward, right? We always populate the task with it, and that is, what the performance expectation is. And it might seem somewhat trivial, like, well, we all know, what the performance expectation or that science standard is being measured, but it's really critical. Everything has to come back up and relate to that, right? That's a driver for the task. It's what the unpacking tool and the task specification tool need to be well aligned to. So it is important that it is there. And from that, then, we're identifying the knowledge, skills, and abilities, those statements which specify what is expected of students to demonstrate, those knowledge, skills, and ability for which we need to have students produce evidence. We often say that all of the standards are not created equally, right? Some are the one that we're looking at in the grade 5 example is fairly discrete, and it's not that complex or dense, if you will, but a lot of NGS standards or science standards are. And of course, as we move through the grades, we expect them to become more complicated and complex and sophisticated. So the KSAs, the number of them, how discrete, how complex they are, the ways in which they integrate the dimensions as documented on the unpacking tool can look different. There's no magic number, but really it's driven by the standard as well as what the dimensions are for that particular standard. And then critically, just like in our summative assessment work, we're thinking about how are students going to demonstrate their learning. So teachers create a list then that aligns back to those KSAs, back to that standard about the ways in which students will demonstrate that they have met the KSAs. And we take the KSAs and we kind of elaborate on them a little bit, or we talk more specifically about how students will demonstrate their knowledge, what type of accuracy, that it will capture all the mechanistic features of observable phenomena if you look through that example list there. So we're kind of further defining then how students will show us what they know. And then those work products, and I want to importantly say too that will constitute the student evidence, right? That evidence that we're going to be evaluating in our rubrics later on. We're beginning to think about that. So then what are the carriers of it? What are the vehicles of this evidence? What do those work products look like? So it could be drawing a model, completing a model, a constructed response. It may be a selected response. It could be having students create a graph, depending again on the unpacking tool and that particular standard that's being measured. What will be those carriers or vehicles that will house the evidence that will be evaluated about student learning? And then we talk about task features and aspects of an assessment task that can be varied. And I'm hoping as I'm going through this, you're making some connections to what Daisy has shared about those phases in evidence-centered design and principled assessment design, and where there are some corollaries here with what we're doing and asking teachers to think about in order to develop high-quality science assessment tasks. So these task features, these are things that are more or less required. They may not all be evident in every single prompt or question within a task, but these are things that are critical to ensure that we can ultimately support what we say we want kids to know and can do, and that really do need to be present. So for example, we want it driven by a high quality scenario that sets students up to be thinking about the phenomena or the design problem that those questions will come against. We want them to have to use reasoning and process skills that produce evidence. We want them to have to integrate the dimensions for a particular PE to demonstrate what they know and can do. And we want them to be fair and equitable, which is very critical. We want the content to be accessible. We know a wide range of learners will be interacting with these assessments, and we want to ensure that we have multiple modes of representation of the content, multiple modes of response, and so on. So that's an expectation of any high quality, well-written task. And then there are some things that can be varied. All prompts and questions, just like in summative assessment, shouldn't be of equal complexity, right? We would expect a range, and maybe the introduction of these questions kind of go from less to more complex and kind of scaffold the student as they move through the task. So what are some things that can be varied to change the complexity or the focus of the task? And also ways in which teachers then for individual learners can think about how to use these features of the task in variable ways. So, you know, possibly we might give information about different degrees of information or background information. We might have different ways in which we present a model, or the way students are to complete a model, the number of components in the model, the number of the different types of matter that might be represented, again, particular to this PE. So here the teacher has some flexibility, if you will, but they're having to think hard about a range of students and how do I ensure that, and for my purpose in terms of where I am in my teaching and what I want to find out about what students know and can do. These are some things that I can vary as a test designer, as a task designer. And of course, then we want to be thinking about those assessment boundaries. So what is it that cannot be assessed? And we all know, like through alignment studies and evaluation of summative assessments, you know, we want to ensure that what is being assessed is appropriate for that grade and aligns back up to those intended standards to be measured. So what is it that students are not expected to know? And often in NGSS and in the state standards, those assessment boundaries are actually written right in there. So we want that documented in the task specification tool. And we also think about the relationship of this task in science to its sisters, if you will, in mathematics and English language arts. So we would not necessarily be expecting students to create an elaborate argument with claims, evidence, facts, and so on at a particular grade. Maybe the nature of a written explanation would be different, and it would align back to the English language arts expectations. So teachers have to look across that and make sure, again, for as another example, if they're doing mathematical computations, which may be associated with a particular standard, does that align to what the expectations are in mathematics? So another critical piece. And again, using those same resources to inform their work.
Charlene, this is Liz. I just want to do a time check. It's 2:35.
Okay.
We've got about 20 slides left or so.
Okay, 5 minutes? Is that what you said? Okay, all right, we'll move through here. Thank you. We can go to the next slide. Okay, and so then getting back down to the assessment development, now that we have the tools in place to create that task, we're thinking about the development along the way, but here really focusing on the development of a scoring rubric and scoring notes so that we have a way to effectively evaluate the student evidence and really to determine their level of proficiency of the measured content. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the purposes then of those tasks really are to help teachers get their fingers on the pulse of where individual students are and to inform their instruction. Where might they need to make adjustments? And that evidence then, in order to make those judgments, really has to require students to integrate the dimensions and their facility and ability to integrate, make sense of reasoning of those dimensions to explain phenomena or design problems. And we do know that a task could include multiple parts, questions, or prompts, and again, with a range of ways in which we're presenting content. Next slide, please. So just an example of a classroom task and some of the components that we talk about when we're working with educators. So what's that anticipatory set that might situate a student to what this task is going to be about? And how many things do I have to respond to? 1 or 2 or 4 or 5? So it sets them up to have a going into the task and understanding of potentially what it might be about, the topic of it, and then, you know, how many things do I have to do in this task? We create a stimulus that's a good driver for students to be able to explain phenomena or identify a problem and a design solution. We have particular prompts and questions that really detail in an accessible way for students, what do I need to do to respond to this question well? And we see a variety of types of questions. So in this case, a variable feature providing a partial model that students complete, and then an explanation of their thinking using the information from the model to explain the phenomena. Next slide, please. So again, those tasks, based on those tasks that have been developed, the rubrics are a really critical part in order for teachers to be able to interpret and evaluate student evidence. And we want to ensure that as a rubric is written across a rating scale or a range of points, there are clear distinctions about student performance, and we want to think about what that evidence and performance might look like across a range of learners. So we want to consider all the ways student evidence of learning is collected. Again, we want to ensure that it's directly aligned to those KSAs that are being measured and that have been selected for measurement on a particular task, and that it really does allow us, by looking at what a high-level response is and a low-level response is, to look at making decisions about what students understand, where they may have some misconceptions or where there might be gaps in their understanding. So some example rubrics for you. This is pretty typically what the components look like. So they might be organized by prompt or question or dimension. Typically there's some type of a rating scale so that performance can be categorized, if you will. And then there are very specific criteria that should allow a teacher to use this to interpret student evidence of what they know and can do, and to see distinctions across those performances. Okay. And just another, okay, yeah, that's fine. And another example for grade 8. And again, all of these resources are in our website for your reference. And then finally, talking about the student exemplars, we do know that educators find great utility and usefulness in talking with students, and also for their own understanding of what a high quality response is that should match exactly that criteria in the rubric. What does a high quality response look like? It should be scientifically accurate. That's a requirement, right? It needs to be complete, coherent, and it should allow a teacher to kind of get an idea of what that response looks like, and also to consistently and reliably interpret those responses, right? So they're making the same inferences using that rubric across a range of tasks that are contain evidence of what students know and can do. And just some examples then of a student exemplar model. They started with a partial model. It's completed here. It does address particles too small to be seen, as well as looking at some of the scale of these particles in a before and after condition. And then on the next slide, what a student response might look like with respect to explanation. So on that next slide, Liz, yeah. So when we ask educators to write these exemplars, we really want them to think about how would a child say, how would a 10-year-old say it, right? So what's the way in which it might be structured for interpretation and use by an educator to evaluate that evidence and rate the understanding of the student? And Rhonda. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Shar. Hi, I'm Rhonda True, and I am going to be talking to you about the actual application of this process and use of the tools and templates that we've developed in the project. I am the Enhanced Assessment Grant Coordinator at the Nebraska Department of Education, and Nebraska being the lead state, I coordinate this grant and work with not only our state vendor here in Nebraska, which is NWEA, but also with our educators across the state and with the partners with SCILLSS. Next slide. So basically, our theory of action for Nebraska, for our assessment system, really calls for our college and career ready standards to be implemented systematically and systemically. And we really feel this principal design approach facilitates us to be able to do that, because it does provide coherence in our system. And I'll be talking about how we're utilizing the PAD approach to actually keeping this coherence in our assessment system. We're finding it's also leading to instructional shifts by our teachers. So as our teachers are being involved in developing and designing these assessment tasks using principal assessment design, they're thinking about what are they going to have to do in their classrooms so students provide evidence for this type of high quality task. So we're also, and that being said, we're growing the assessment literacy of our teachers. They're thinking about themselves as designers of assessments and how will I write a prompt for 2 dimensions to make sure I guarantee I get evidence about whatever they're needing or wanting, being the teacher in the classroom. And then that being said, when they use this approach, they're getting results from students that are meaningful, that they didn't miss the mark. Like, I gave the assessment and that wasn't how I thought students would respond. By utilizing this approach, their assessments will be more reliable and valid. And then they can use the scores to impact their instruction. Okay, next slide. So how are we using it to garner coherence in our assessment system? Basically, we are using the approach, the tools, and the templates in professional learning across our state. We have involved educators in this process, as well as our professional developers from our educational service units. And we're going out and we're sharing this approach and having them then deliver it even further to classrooms and districts. We also, this current summer, and I'll delve into this a little bit more deeply, but we repurposed our summative assessment development to focus on formative this summer. Since COVID hit, we were not able to give our field test for science last spring. And so therefore we still have our field test ready to give this upcoming spring. So we're like, let's repurpose our summative assessment writing and bring teachers in across the state to develop formative tasks that will support them in their teaching and instruction this summer. So they came in this summer, and I'll talk more about that. But we've focused on bringing principal assessment design into professional learning. We're bringing principal assessment design into our science assessment system through formative tasks. And then we're hoping to scale up the processes from this summer to our summative assessment development, this continued summative assessment development this summer of 2021. Next slide. So like I said, this summer, this June and July, we really shifted our focus. We brought in about 58 teachers and professional developers, as well as NWA was collaborative in this process, as well as NDE folks. And we developed 24 classroom tasks using the principal assessment design, using the tools and the rubrics and the processes, 24 for grade 5 and 25 or 4 or 5 for grade 8. And we really feel that they span the breadth and depth of our Nebraska standards. So these will go into a repository this late fall, and then teachers will have access to those, and they can literally use the tasks that are there, or they can use the design tools that will be also available to create their own tasks. So they could go in and look at a task specification tool and pull out some different knowledge, skills, and abilities and design their own task as well. And then, like I said, in summer of 2021, next summer, in our summative task development, we want to focus on the principal design approach, bring back teachers now who have more experiences in developing the formative tasks, those who have used the formative tasks across our state. 5th and 8th grade is the 2 grade levels that we test for statewide summative. And we really feel we're growing our capacity of our teachers across our state to utilize this process to create high quality tasks. Next slide. We also feel across the state that we have got support from our Nebraska Association of Teachers of Science, which we call NATS. We have had a 2-day pop-up conference in January where we brought in 50 educators and professional developers there and developed classroom formative tasks for 5th, 8th, and high school life, earth, and sciences. I personally have presented at the NATS pop-up conference about our project, about the tools and templates, about the process for the past 2 years, and I have teachers who were working this past summer in the formative workshop and myself, we have applied to present again this upcoming fall. And then our Nebraska Educational Service Units, or our ESUs, who lead our regional professional learning, many of them participated this past summer, this current summer, or past, I don't know, we're in August, so this summer, with this development of these formative tasks, many of them participated and look forward to using the professional learning tools and templates that are available on the SCILLSS website. They are thrilled because we have a professional toolkit there, professional learning toolkit, where they can literally just pick up the PowerPoints. They can modify tools and templates as needed. There are examples for them to show as they go out and start to support districts in their professional learning of how do we do this process? How do we write a task that is high quality and gives us the evidence to say this is what our kids know and can do. And if I get evidence that shows they can't, then that'll impact my instruction. And so that's hugely important. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to share some comments from the SCILLSS pilot tasks. We had Nebraska teachers, Montana and Wyoming, who were involved in developing classroom tasks and taking them out to students this past spring. And then students taking the tasks and gathering evidence. And then as the project, we looked back at that evidence, looked back at what teachers said about the process, about how students did, and about the process of actually writing the tasks and going through this process. And they did talk about time as a factor to learn this process, that it does take time. They also, it's not on my script here, but I know they would tell you that it will hugely impact how they teach because now they understand like more deeply what our standards are. And they also understand more deeply that how they're going to elicit evidence from students. And so that will also be impacted in their instruction. They also notice things like when we write formative tasks, we often ask kids sometimes to respond in an open response or a constructive response. And they found that their students, like that was an area they were needing more growth in. And so in Nebraska, what we've done, we've worked with NWA, and we've done a writing with evidence workshop to support our teachers with that as well. So you can read some of the other statements here, but it really is, this process really is growing our teachers across our state, and we still have a lot of work to do, but I do feel we're on the right track. I feel like we're really having consistency and coherence in our science assessment system, and I don't feel we'll have science teachers say to us, wow, that statewide summative test looks so different. My kids have never had experiences with those types of tasks in our classrooms, because we're developing in them in a very similar way, and we involve our teachers in all of these processes, both formative and of course in our summative science tests. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. So, any comments and questions? I will post this contact information, and you can share that this would be posted later for others' reference. So, any questions? I cannot see the chat box of someone else. I'm presenting this, so someone else will have to do that.
Liz, I think we've answered most things in the chat box currently.
Okay.
Oh, here's something just came in. Oh, just from the NCME staff, thanking everyone for joining. And there is a session evaluation link there as well, if you would please complete that. Okay, one more question just came in. Is there any way we can get this PowerPoint?
Erin, I think we can post this on our resources page, and it'll also be included within the publication at NCME makes as well, correct?
Yes, in fact, I can go ahead and post the PowerPoint today, and I'm putting in our project website in the chat box. So once you go to the skillspartners.org, if you click on the resources tab and scroll down, you'll see all of the presentation PowerPoints posted there. So you should see it here in the next 20-30 minutes or so.
Any other questions? All right. Well, we greatly appreciate everyone attending. We hope we've been able to answer questions today and share some new and interesting and useful information with all of you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any questions. You can contact any one of us. We're happy to talk further about this project. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.